So we already looked at suprematism, one group within the Russian avant-garde, and the suprematist approach to abstraction. Here we're going to look at Vladimir Tatlin, who is a representative of constructivism, another group within the Russian avant-garde. And his mixed media construction here, corner counter relief. Tatlin did not call himself an artist. He referred to himself as a constructor, hence the name of this movement. And he referred to his work as lab work. Thinking about the Russian political context of the revolution, I think this choice is very significant because it doesn't relegate art to the kind of lofty realm of the artistic geniuses, but it makes it very practical work. It's lab work. It's something anybody can learn to do. Like so many others, Tatlin traveled to Paris in 1912 and visited Picasso in his studio where he saw Picasso working on his guitar. So what lessons has Tatlin learned from Picasso? Well, we see the use of non-art materials in Tatlin's work, just as we did in Picasso's. There's also, though, many things he's doing differently. His work is non-representational. He's also suspending his work over a corner. Again, a different relationship with the art object and the viewer. We are occupying the same space. That's a little bit different than the single cohesive object of Picasso's guitar. The Bauhaus is a design school that covered many different areas of visual culture, and it was founded in Germany in 1919. And even though it's over 100 years old now, we'll find that some of the Bauhaus work still feels very modern and very new to us. In their manifesto, as avant-garde artists were so eager to write, the Bauhaus members said there's no boundaries between craft, sculpture, and painting. In fact, all art forms are united under architecture. And the founder, Walter Gropius, who also designed their main campus here in 1926, he really wanted to create what he called a new building of the future, where all art forms are united and they raise up everyone and make good design accessible to everyone, that everybody could live in a good, clean, modern house with modern furniture, modern textiles, and that would help us all to have better lives. If we look at the design of the school, we can see the dictate form follows function. That's the slogan of another modern artist, Mies van der Rohe, who was a later director of the Bauhaus. The idea that you don't need to be a slave to symmetry, for example, but each wing of the Bauhaus looks different because it has a different function. And so function is the first consideration. For example, here this is the dormitory wing, which looks very different than this workshop wing that we see here that has this huge glass curtain wall to flood the workshops with natural light. This is one of the most famous designs to have come out of the Bauhaus. And I mean, you know, we've all seen this chair in like the dentist waiting room and many other places. The school was divided into workshops for furniture design, metalwork, weaving, printmaking, theater, architecture, and it worked almost like a medieval guild. There's also an interest in industry here, and we see this kind of sleek metallic design, the tubular steel chair. The idea was to create things that were modern and innovative, but also not just for the one percenters, but something that could be cheaply mass reproduced and available to everyone. And that dream didn't quite work out the way the Bauhaus had hoped, but in a way, it has come to us in a different kind of more capitalist form of IKEA and Target. I mean, think about IKEA and Target without chairs like this, or without dishes like this. This is Mariana Brandt's coffee and tea service. Women were a large presence at the Bauhaus, and they faced discrimination and were not equal partners, but they did have more opportunities there than in more conventional art schools. Because that focus on design allowed for a greater breakdown between the so-called areas of high and low art, or between art and craft, and often women historically had been relegated to that area of craft. Again, we see that emphasis on industrial forms, careful attention to functionality and the ease of use, and that machine aesthetic that really strips down any ornament and decoration. The Bauhaus has an enormous impact on design ever since. And it really brings us this utopian notion that industry and technology can provide average people with a better quality of life. And we might be more cynical about that idea today, but it's still powerful. Oh, and I just wanted to bring in our two teacups here to compare. I think this is a really interesting comparison, the kind of functionality of the Bauhaus tea set versus the lack of functionality in Merritt Oppenheim's surrealist sculpture, Luncheon in Fur. All right, our final movement for this week is the Harlem Renaissance. And here we go back to the United States. The Harlem Renaissance comes about after a period of major demographic change in the U.S. called the Great Migration. This occurs in the early decades of the 20th century when many Black Americans seeking work and more freedoms moved from the rural, mostly agricultural South to come live and work in urban, industrialized cities in the North. And New York's Harlem neighborhood became a nexus for Black writers, musicians, artists, who all started to emerge and build an amazingly vital community. This is the age of the Golden 20s, the Jazz age. The Cotton Club opens up, and it becomes the place for people to go to see live music in New York. What's interesting, though, about the Cotton Club is that the performers were all Black, but the audience was white. And so we still have to remember that this is an era of extreme racism, segregation, and Jim Crow. Let's take a look at some of the visual work from the Harlem Renaissance, and we'll start here with Aaron Douglas's Crucifixion. This is part of a series of illustrations for sermons. And what's interesting is he takes an episode from the crucifixion of Christ, but shows us a different perspective, because here we see this tiny figure here in the foreground with a halo. This is actually Christ. Who's featured in this series of in this image of the crucifixion is actually Simon. Simon carrying the cross for Christ. Simon is understood to be an African Jew. In the story of the Passion or the Crucifixion of Christ that's told in the Christian New Testament, Simon helps Christ kind of carry his burden. And the figure of Simon as an African becomes a metaphor for the Black American experience, where their contributions, their work, their culture are often ignored and forgotten. Douglas goes on to work on a huge project as part of the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. The WPA was part of President Roosevelt's New Deal program that helped to put Americans back to work after the Great Depression. And the WPA gave artists work. Isn't that cool? The federal government gave artists jobs. They painted murals in post offices and libraries. They painted murals at national parks. And Douglass goes to the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library and creates a series of murals called Aspects of Negro Life. And we're looking at two parts of this larger mural project here. On the left, the Negro in an African setting, and below, From Slavery Through Reconstruction. And what we see is, especially here in the left, we see Douglass looking to Africa for inspiration, to proudly display native Africans in a stylized way that is not caricaturized or not stereotypical. His signature style was what he called the Egyptian form, figures silhouetted in profile with the eye rendered from a frontal viewpoint, so like in ancient Egyptian art. And his silhouette figures are really simplified and abstracted but in a very different way than, for example, other primitivist works that we've seen in this module. Now, in the mural down below, we see an unfolding of different key events, as it says, from slavery through Reconstruction. So what we have is, in the center, a man standing on a kind of a speaker's stand here, holding up a document with people gathered around him, some of them celebrating in the background. This is the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's radiating light because, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation is what granted slaves freedom in the United States. That figure is then pointing to a building on the hill. This is the U.S. Capitol building, as if to urge Black Americans to vote and be engaged. But not everybody is able to even have the opportunity to hear this message. We still see Blacks here in the foreground picking cotton, not yet aware of this message. We also see in the background here looming threats that just as Black Americans are finally going to get their freedom, we see groups like the KKK, other what we would call alt-right or white supremacist groups moving in to threaten the rights of Black Americans. And I think that this work is especially powerful today in our current political climate, where we talk about the voting rights of marginalized groups of Americans being suppressed, and how important that right to vote and that right to participate in our democracy are for all Americans.